The late Dolores Williams, a black female theologian, summarizes the themes of today's problematic fave as follows: slavery, poverty, ethnicity, sexual and economic exploitation, surrogacy, rape, domestic violence, homelessness, motherhood, single parenting, alienation, and radical encounters with God. There is a lot happening in our story for today. Now, unlike the story of Eve and Adam, where we began our series, Problematic Faves, I do not quite know how to reinterpret our way through the story in search of good news. I have no new angle to offer or hidden meaning to unearth. I can only tell the story and trust that the God who met Hagar in the wilderness will meet us here today. Now, our story begins with Sarai, Abram's wife. Sarai is better known as Sarah and Abram as Abraham. But they have not yet received these names. And as we learn in the very first line in the story, they also have not received what God has promised them they will receive: a child. Now, for a woman living in the ancient Near East, childlessness was an existential threat. To be childless not only meant that you had failed one of your primary duties as a mother, but also could be seen as a sign that you had done something wrong, sinned or transgressed in some way. At best, you might be pitied. At worst, you would be suspect, vulnerable to abuse or abandonment. One can imagine the pressure Sarai was under, especially when one considers Abram has been promised as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. Now, Sarai, though she is under pressure, is not without resources. So in addition to learning that Sarai has no children, we also learn that she has an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. Now, this tidbit tells us something about Sarai's social status. It was common for men of Abram's wealth and status to have multiple wives and female slaves, but it was far less common for women to have their own personal slaves. So this places Sarai in a complicated social position. She is a childless woman in a patriarchal society, married to a woman God has promised countless descendants. And Sarai is an enslaver. She is both oppressed and oppressor. And in a move which perfectly illustrates the complexity of Sarai's social position, Sarai chooses to give Hagar to Abram as a wife. The law and custom dictated that if Sarai gave Hagar to Abram and Hagar had a child with Abram, then that child would be considered Sarai's child, thus solving the problem of Sarah's inability to have her own. Now, Hagar's consent for this is not required according to the law, and nor does it seem to be requested according to the story. Sarai leverages what little power she has to survive and gives her slave to Abram. She manages to secure her future once Hagar becomes pregnant, but doing so requires her to exploit someone in a more vulnerable position than her own. And it would seem that even Hagar's pregnancy could not resolve Sarai's fears. Not long after Hagar conceives, Sarai begins to abuse her, using Hagar's perfectly reasonable contempt for her as an excuse. Sarai's treatment of Hagar is described with the same language used to describe how the Hebrews were treated while they were enslaved in Egypt. This is really harsh abuse. She deals with Hagar so harshly that Hagar chooses to flee into the wilderness alone and pregnant. Now, in doing so, Hagar becomes, in the words of Dolores Williams, the first woman in the Bible to liberate herself from oppressive power structures. Here, Hagar seems to exercise power that no one quite expected. But her liberation in the wilderness does not last long. And perhaps the most heartbreaking twist of the story, when God meets Hagar in the wilderness, God asks her to go back. The same God who parted the seas to rescue the Hebrews from their bondage in Egypt now commands Hagar to return to hers. No matter how many times I read this story, this part of the story remains a mystery to me. I don't get it. Maybe God knew Hagar would not survive in the wilderness, or maybe God thought Hagar's return would change Sarai's mind in some way. I don't know. No matter how I spin it, I simply do not understand why God asks this of Hagar. And nor, to be honest, do I understand why Hagar agrees. But Hagar, for her part, does not seem to be overwhelmed by what God is telling her to do. In fact, the author tells us that in response to God's command, Hagar gives God a name: El Roi, the God who sees me. Now, I don't want us to miss what has just happened. Hagar has named God. And names, and God's name in particular, are a big deal in the Old Testament. People are constantly asking for God's name, and God always manages to kind of skip around the question, give a non-answer. To learn a God's name in the minds of ancient folks is to gain mastery over that God, to claim that God's power as your own. And Hagar doesn't even ask what God's name is. Hagar simply chooses to name God herself. And this is important because no one else in the entire Bible does this. Not Abraham, not Moses, not even Jesus. Hagar is the one person to give God her own name. She refuses to call God by the name she would have learned from the people who enslaved her. Instead, she gives God a name that is for her and her alone. Dolores Williams calls this a strike against patriarchal power at its highest level, an act of defiance and resistance. And somehow, this encounter, this act of naming, gives Hagar the strength she needs to return. And that's where our story ends. Hagar returns to Sarai and Abram's house, where she gives birth to a son, Ishmael. And in the next few chapters of Genesis, we learn how Sarai eventually does have a child of her own, named Isaac. And though things are peaceful for a time in their household, eventually Sarai's fear over her position returns, and she forces Hagar into the wilderness again, this time along with her son, Ishmael. There is no happy ending here. This story is a painful one. I think what makes it so painful and so powerful is how true this story is. For those who have not yet read Jasmine's reflection from our Break with a Purpose trip, she writes about encountering a similar story about a woman enslaved in the United States who also found strength in God's presence despite her brutal circumstances. And in her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, Dolores Williams outlines the clear parallels between Hagar's story and the stories of Black women being forced into roles of servitude and surrogacy throughout our nation's history, not just during slavery. Now, these parallels bring something to clarity for me in these stories. So often when we encounter a problematic story like this one, in the Bible or in the world, our first question, myself included, is to ask why God does not do more. Why doesn't God intervene? We want these stories to end like the Exodus story, where God's people are suffering and God responds by breaking the very laws of nature to set them free. But as I read this story, my question shifts to this. Whose job was it to free Hagar? Abram, for his part, could have said no to taking Hagar as his wife. Abram could have prevented Sarai from treating her harshly. Abram could have gone after Hagar when she fled into the wilderness. At every point in the story, Abram had the power to do something, and he never did. So whose job was it to free Hagar? Was it God's or Abram's? Whose job was it to free enslaved Black women? Was it God's or their enslavers? And today, when we are confronted by the suffering and exploitation of the poor and oppressed, whose job is it to work toward their freedom? Is it God's or ours? Here I am reminded of a passage from the book of James. It says, "What good is it, my siblings, if you can say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a sibling is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill,' and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead." Now, I do want to acknowledge that this story for today is not a story about power in general, but patriarchal power in particular. And so as a man, Hagar's story carries a specific word of judgment for me as a beneficiary of that power. But I do think this story implicates all of us, not just men. After all, there is another character in the story, Sarai. And we, like Sarai, live under power structures we did not choose. Patriarchy, capitalism, racism, ableism, just to name a few. And these power structures make us complicit in the exploitation and oppression of others, even when we do not want to be. We may not own someone named Hagar, but much of what we do own would not exist without the exploitation of people like her. And I know many of you are as enraged as I am that our tax dollars, once they flee our paychecks, fund all manner of human rights abuses in our country and beyond. We, like Sarai, are oppressed and oppressor. Not by choice, but true nonetheless. And so let us acknowledge that Sarai, vulnerable and disempowered as she was, could have made different choices. She may not have been able to destroy the patriarchy, but she could have trusted in God's promise instead of taking matters into her own hands. She could have responded to Hagar's contempt with repentance and reparation. Sarai did not have to be oppressed and oppressor. There was another way for her, just as there is for us. What does my faith mean if it does not challenge me to resist my complicity in the exploitation and suffering of others? What does my faith mean if it does not move me to abandon privilege and join God in solidarity with the oppressed? And fair, the web of power structures at work in the world today is too complex for me or for you or any one of us to undo with our own actions. Perhaps it is so complex that God is the only one who could undo it all. But I do believe God is calling us to more than passive resignation at the powers that be. I believe God is calling us to more than shouting our rage and frustration into the void. God is calling us to do what Abram and Sarai would not, to love Hagar enough to fight for her liberation. And so if you are like me, wondering how to respond to that call, I urge you to take advantage of the opportunities that have been laid before you to respond to that call with others. Come to the interest meeting for Wayfinders after worship. Come to the community organizing event this week on Wednesday night. If you're not on Discord, get on Discord and join and pay attention to the PH political channel, where your peers are sharing resources and information about how to resist the storm unleashed by the Trump administration. Friends, we will not change the world overnight. But God is not calling us to change the world, only to be faithful in love and in justice. So may we answer the call for the sake of Hagar. Amen.